Today, we're looking at a case that, well, truly shook India. The winter of 2006. A quiet neighborhood in Noida suddenly became the center of a nightmare. We're talking about the Nithari Killings, a place where children just vanished, one after another.
It's definitely a horrifying true crime story, but the murders themselves, gruesome as they are, they're almost just the start. This case, when you really dig into it, shows this deep systemic breakdown. It's about more than just the crime.
Exactly. And that's what we want to explore today. We need to get past the really sensational headlines, all the talk about cannibals and strange rituals.
Which mostly weren't proven.
Right. And look at the real story. The failures in the system, the class bias that seems pretty undeniable, and the legal mess that followed for nearly 2 decades. How does this even happen? And why couldn't the system deliver clear justice?
Well, it begins, tragically, with silence. Before the big discovery, for, well, over a year, children were disappearing from Nithari village. This is mostly a poorer area, right next to the much wealthier Sector 31. We're talking about the children of laborers, domestic workers, drivers.
And it wasn't just 1 or 2 kids. The sources point to a pattern, right? Maybe 8, 10, even more children, all from similar backgrounds. Gone.
And the parents did try to get help. They went straight to the local police. They reported their children missing.
But what happened?
Their pleas were essentially ignored. Because they were poor, their concerns just didn't seem to register. The police response, they kept calling them runaway cases.
Runaways. That many children all at once.
Exactly. They even suggested, apparently, that maybe the kids had just wandered off to find work for a bit of money. It's damning, really.
Just think about that indifference. The police apparently preferred the idea that dozens of young kids simultaneously abandoned their families over investigating, well, something sinister. It implies their lives just weren't seen as urgent, less important.
And that blindness, that refusal to see, it continued until December 2006, until things became impossible to ignore, literally.
Because of the smell, right? That's what finally broke through.
Yes. This awful stench started spreading through Sector 31. And the residents there, who had more influence, they complained. They tracked it down.
To a drain behind one particular house.
A house owned by a businessman, Moninder Singh Pandher. His domestic helper, Surinder Koli, also lived and worked there. And when the police finally searched the property prompted by the neighbors, not the missing children's families, well, that's when the horror came out.
It must have been just horrific. What did they find?
Human remains, skulls, bones, decaying flesh. Some were buried near the drains, others just stuffed into plastic bags.
So the children the police dismissed as runaways. They were right there, all along, for months.
It's a direct link back to that initial failure, isn't it? The fact that remains were practically out in the open, near a drain, for so long, it just highlights how badly the first response failed. The country was, understandably, absolutely shocked, outraged, and that public pressure forced a change.
Yeah, the local police had clearly shown they couldn't handle it, or perhaps worse. So the case was handed over pretty quickly, wasn't it?
Immediately to the CBI, the Central Bureau of Investigation, India's top agency, taking it away from the local police, basically admitted the local system was, well, compromised.
Okay, so the CBI steps in. What's their approach?
They focused on the 2 men, Pandher, the owner, and Koli, the helper. And Surinder Koli confessed.
He confessed to everything.
He described luring children into the house, killing them, and then getting rid of the bodies. He talked about having these uncontrollable urges.
Right. But even with that confession, things weren't straightforward, were they? The investigation started hitting snags.
Yeah, even early on, investigators noted some, let's say, inconsistencies. Koli's timeline, how he said he disposed of certain remains. It didn't always quite match the state of decomposition or where things were found. Little contradictions started popping up.
And meanwhile, the media...
Oh, the media went into overdrive. It was a frenzy, absolute frenzy. Not just reporting, it felt like theater.
Anchors on TV were pushing these really lurid theories, weren't they?
Yeah.
Organ trading, ritual killings.
Cannibalism, that was a big one. Whispers, headlines, all based on very little actual evidence, but it grabbed attention.
You have to wonder, though, how much did that media storm affect things? Did it put pressure on the CBI to maybe wrap things up quickly, even with those inconsistencies in Koli's story?
It's a valid question. That kind of pressure, that kind of noise, it definitely shapes the narrative. It makes it harder to focus on the procedural details, maybe. But despite all that noise, the initial trials did move forward. Between roughly 2007 and 2017, we saw the first wave of judgment.
And Koli was convicted.
Repeatedly. Sentenced to death in several of the cases. Pandher, his employer, was also convicted in some instances. The accusation was that he either helped or at least knew and allowed it to happen on his property.
So for the families.
Yeah.
After the police ignoring them, then the media circus. These convictions must have felt like, finally, some kind of justice, some closure.
You'd think so. It certainly looked like the system, however flawed, had eventually delivered a result. But, and this is a huge but, when an investigation has shaky foundations, the whole thing can eventually crumble.
Which brings us to years later and this massive legal U-turn. The Allahabad High Court review. This is where it gets really critical, right?
Absolutely critical. Because the High Court didn't just glance at the evidence again. They did a deep, sharp dissection of how the investigation was conducted. And what they found was shocking.
What kind of failures are we talking about? Specifics?
Really fundamental stuff. Things you'd expect to be basic procedure. For example, the chain of custody for crucial evidence. It was broken.
What does that mean practically?
It means items like the victim's clothes, maybe phones they had, things that could have directly linked the accused to the crime scene. They weren't handled properly, tracked properly, so their value as evidence destroyed. You couldn't reliably say where they'd been or if they'd been tampered with.
Wow. So potentially vital evidence was just rendered useless through incompetence. Or worse.
Investigative malpractice, certainly. Basic procedures just weren't followed. And it gets worse. DNA evidence. In a case like this, with multiple victims, unidentified remains, DNA should be the bedrock. But the court found missing DNA records, incomplete records, contaminated samples.
So they couldn't even definitively match remains to victims or use forensics to place the accused at the scene reliably.
Not reliably enough for a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. The forensic side was just too messy, too compromised.
And there was the confession itself, right? Koli's confession.
Yes. The High Court seriously questioned how that confession was obtained. They raised the possibility it might have been forced, extracted under duress. Essentially, the judges concluded the whole story the prosecution had built was unreliable. It was full of, and I quote, holes and half-truths.
So the court wasn't necessarily saying they didn't do it.
No, they were saying the state, the prosecution, completely failed to prove it. Failed because the investigation itself was so deeply flawed right from the very beginning. The foundation was rotten.
And the result of all this, in 2023?
Acquittals. Both Pandher and Koli were acquitted in the multiple cases that the High Court reviewed. A stunning reversal after all those years and initial convictions.
I can't imagine how the families must have felt. First, their children vanish, they're ignored.
Yeah.
Then years of trials thinking they had some justice.
Only to have it snatched away. Not because of new evidence proving innocence, but because the system itself messed up so badly it couldn't secure a conviction. It's like losing their children all over again, but this time betrayed by the justice system itself.
It really forces us to look beyond just the crime scene tape, doesn't it? This case is like a mirror reflecting some really uncomfortable truths about how institutions work or don't work in India, especially when poverty is involved.
Absolutely. You can really break it down into what the sources suggest is a kind of triple failure.
Okay, what's the first?
First, as we discussed right at the start,
Yeah.
the police negligence and that undeniable class bias. The most vulnerable victims, the poorest families, were simply not heard. That created the space for the crimes to happen and to continue unnoticed by authorities.
Okay, failure number one.
Yeah.
Ignored because they were poor. What's two?
Second, the media sensationalism. All that noise about cannibalism and rituals, it wasn't just inaccurate, it was damaging. It distracted everyone from the real systemic questions. Questions about police accountability, about proper investigation methods, drowned out by horror movie narratives.
So the media chased ratings instead of focusing on the systemic breakdown. And the third failure.
The third ties back to the High Court's findings. The procedural malpractice by the investigators, the CBI in this case, mishandled DNA, broken chain of custody, questionable confession. These aren't just technicalities, they are the bedrock of a fair trial. When those procedures fail, justice fails. It's not just about who did it, it's about whether the system can prove it reliably and fairly. And here, it couldn't. It was a failure of basic competence.
So that bungalow, it's still there in Sector 31.
It stands there, yes. Apparently the drain where the remains were found is sealed now, covered up.
But closing a drain doesn't close the wound, does it? The failure to protect those kids, the failure to listen, the failure ultimately to deliver justice that sticks. that space.
It absolutely does, and it points to a fundamental truth about this case. The real horror wasn't just what happened inside that house, it was also the indifference outside it, the systemic deafness to the cries of the poor. That's what allowed the nightmare to take root and grow.
So, thinking about this whole deep dive, what should you, our listener, take away from Nithari? For me, it's that sloppy police work, mishandled evidence, forced confessions. These aren't small mistakes. They actively destroy the possibility of justice. Whether it's incompetence or something worse, when the system breaks its own rules, it fails everyone.
And that brings us to the really stark final thought, something that captures the essence of the Nithari tragedy. When a child goes missing and no one listens, the horror doesn't begin inside the house, it begins outside it.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How easily a system built to protect can fail the most vulnerable, and how that failure is perhaps the deepest horror of all. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.